I'm Rebecca Bagley, President and CEO of NorTech. It's my pleasure today to be at the City Club on a panel with regards to biomimicry. Our role at NorTech is a technology-based economic development organization who's accelerating the pace of innovation in Northeast Ohio. Biomimicry is definitely a part of our sweet spot, as it's a tool and a wonderful capability to be able to accelerate that pace of innovation. So what is biomimicry? Simply, biomimicry is innovation that by forms, processes, and systems that are found in nature. So when we think about how do we solve a problem and we look to nature to help us solve that problem, that's really what biomimicry is. So it really allows companies to develop cutting-edge products and services, and more they are approaching Mother Nature for these innovative ideas. When we think about, and we'll give some more examples as we go through, but we think about some examples using really a spider web concept to make sure that birds don't run into windows over and over and over again, and are killed through running into windows. There's trains that they have been more energy efficient and the ability to go faster by looking at the bird's beak and how the bird's beak works and really using that streamlined concept on the trains. And also more efficient wind turbines by looking at the bumps on a whale and kind of how those bumps on the whale's flippers work. So over the last few years, biomimicry has seen incredible growth as it's utilized in these different markets. When we think about patents, scholarly articles, research grants, they've increased by 5 times since 2000. Also, when you think by 2030, we think the field will account for $425 billion of the US GDP and $1.6 trillion of the global total output. So today we think we want to talk about both biomimicry as a whole, but also it's incredible how poised Northeast Ohio is to take advantage of this emerging opportunity. And much of that is due to the work of the people on this panel and a whole set of partners in Northeast Ohio executing that work. So we have Tom Tyrrell, who's a serial entrepreneur and founder and CEO of Great Lakes Biomimicry. We have Dr. Peter Niewiarowski, a professor of evolutionary biology and integrated bioscience at the University of Akron, where he is in charge of the Biomimicry Fellowship Program. And we have Dr. Vin Ochaya, who's an associate professor of business administration, and he's also the director of entrepreneurship and sustainability, the MBA program at Baldwin Wallace University. So it's very exciting to welcome this panel and clearly have a lot of expertise here, and as we can see how Northeast Ohio and the globe can really capture this opportunity. So the first question I'd like to ask, and maybe everybody can address this, is what are some examples? Why is this cool? What can we really see this in?
I'll start.
Since he has an animal in his lap, he's allowed to.
I'll talk about just 2 examples really briefly, one that I know something about and another that I gleaned from a great site that you might want to be aware of. It's called biomimicrynews.com, and it's dozens or even hundreds of examples of biomimicry, and it's updated on a weekly basis. I work on geckos and how they stick, and this is the first gecko that's been in the City Club, I understand, and she's sticking to this plate of glass because the bottoms of her feet are covered with a very fine hair, finer than our own hairs. And those tiny hairs end in little plates that allow her to get really close to the glass, literally really close to the glass. And their intermolecular forces are important, and so she can actually stick without any glue or secretions, nothing like that. So it's a dry adhesive. It's really interesting in lots of contexts. And it's something that I really enjoy working on. There are lots of different applications. One of them that's really interesting is in electronics and sticking components of electronics into things like a cell phone. My colleague invented carbon nanotubes to mimic those hairs, creating a tape that would stick electronic pieces together and also conduct heat away from those elements, lowering the power requirements. So that's a really interesting example of biomimicry with some human ingenuity as well added to it, because carbon nanotubes are not really interesting to geckos. The other example that I just came across from this news service is has to do with materials, hard materials, a lampshade oyster that's translucent. Its shells are translucent, and it's really hard. And one of the ways that those shells are different from other kinds of oysters, besides being translucent, is the shells are tough to protect them against predators that try to get into the soft parts to eat them. And it turns out that's really of value potentially to people that are looking to make, bulletproof glass or something like that. We don't know how to make the composites that these oysters make and that other mollusks make on a regular basis, but we're learning about how to make those materials from the lessons of the natural models. So those are just two that come to mind.
I wasn't nervous for today's panel until Peter said, geckos can do very unexpected things, so if she does, just breathe. I said, okay. So, Tom?
Yeah, I'll go next. It's hard to follow Catherine the gecko for an example. But I will also use an example that's personal to me, which actually might mean something to some of you folks. I grew up on the plains of the savannah of East Africa, and as such, I was growing up in nature all the time. So some of the things that we now believe to be biomimetic examples of what we can take advantage of, I grew up looking at it but not understanding exactly what the potential was for addressing some of the problems that biomimicry is now addressing. So for example, if you ever find yourself out there, you'll see lots and lots of termite hills that grow up 20, 30 feet high. And as a kid running around, I used to be fascinated by these little, things constantly opening and closing vents all around the mound. And to me, at the time, it seemed like a complete waste of time, because that's all they seemed to do, all throughout the day. But only recently did I realize that there was actually a reason for them to do that. As you know, a termite hill has got channels and chimneys. And so in that environment, the termites are actually trying to modulate the temperature. If you're a termite, the best temperature for you is about 87 degrees, give or take a degree. And if you're in Africa, you'll see temperatures from 30 degrees in the morning to 110 degrees during the daytime. And if you measure the termite hill, it is 87 degrees regardless of what it is outside. So now think about that in terms of the building constructions that, for example, in South Africa, that now they have. Architects have tried to use that knowledge to build 3, 4, 5-story buildings using that principle that I just kind of explained. So the benefit of that is those buildings actually now have 90% less need for air conditioning and cooling. Now, take Northeast Ohio in the summer. Of course, we complain about it in the winter, but in the summer, I think that's a really good tool. There's a lot more examples like that, and I think we're going to come around and talk to a lot of them. So, Tom?
Yeah, I think mine's personal experience, too. During the 90s, when I was running steel companies, I spent a lot of time in Japan, probably being over there about a dozen times, and getting on the Shinkansen, the bullet trains, and going all over the country, never realizing what went into it. And it kind of draws on the train that Rebecca talked about in her intro. When that train was designed, before I wrote it, it was designed as a bullet. Those of us that are over 60 remember Flash Gordon on TV, and that was exactly what the shape of the train looked like. Well, at 350 kilometers an hour, as it went through the tunnels in Japan, which were many, it was making sonic booms coming out, which obviously was not very acceptable in the process. Fortunately, the Japanese company had a birder, an amateur ornithologist on their engineering staff, and looked at the problem and said, we need to think about the elements that we're going from and to. And if we take a look at something like a kingfisher, which goes from one element air, dives into a second element water without leaving a splash, that's something we should consider. Well, sure enough, they took the engine, they redesigned the whole engine. They took the nose of the kingfisher, the beak, and put it on. Then they took the sides and they mimicked the silent flight feathers of an owl. And not only did it go through without a sonic boom, but it increased the speeds by 15% and decreased fuel consumption by 15%. And to me, that's exactly the opportunities that are out there for biomimicry.
And maybe, Tom, Tyrrell, you can build on this point a little bit to talk about really how companies and organizations can use biomimicry as innovation tools.
Well, I think the key is that very few companies think about what would nature do. They are, in fact, let's face it, nature's 3.8 billion years old. They've solved every problem that's out there, and if they haven't, they're not around anymore. We as civilization, especially the last 200 years, have been virtually antithetical to that process, doing everything to go the other direction, and we're obviously paying the price today. With global warming, et cetera. And as companies begin to embrace this process, which to me is neat because sustainability took about 25 years to get where it is today. Only the last 5 years, CEOs being able to sell it to their boards because they saw the attraction and retention of employees, and the same thing with their clients, that it was quantifiable into dollars. Well, as they begin to look at biomimicry, you can sit and listen to this today, go back to your business, think about what would nature do, and literally think about a solution that could solve a problem tomorrow. So it's an instantaneous gratification in the process. So companies that begin to embody the philosophy of looking through a biomimetic lens to the quiver of lenses that they normally look through, not only begin to solve problems that way, but it begins to change all the other lenses that they've used. Biomimicry is not going to solve every problem that's out there, but it's going to make you think differently about the way you deal with people, the way you deal with the environment. And one of our friends at one of our companies that we engaged fellows with said the other day he had been at Procter & Gamble, and he said, I envision the day when Procter & Gamble will have 15 biologists or biologically related people working in their operations, because biologists at the table is what will begin to change that thinking, creating conditions for other people to be able to broaden their mindsets.
And Tom, that's a great transition for maybe Peter to pick up, because Peter Niewiarowski, as I mentioned, runs the fellowship program in biomimicry, and so he has his students in these companies working.
Right, and actually there are a bunch of fellows, biomimicry fellows that are here today. Maybe they could just raise their hands. I think that one of the things that Tom said about innovation and changing thinking right away is absolutely true, but there's another side to this, which is sort of the mid to long-term view about how we think about doing innovation. We have fellows that have come to Northeast Ohio to earn their PhDs in biomimicry, and they're working with companies, on a long-term basis to not only allow for that pathway that gets quick results where that's possible, but also that they're embedded in those companies as a way of changing the kind of the culture of innovation, not to replace what's already there and what's already working, but to complement it with something that's different. And I think the companies tell us, as they work with the fellows, that that's something extraordinarily valuable, which is that we're adding another tool that doesn't stand alone or doesn't compete with their existing tools. It actually extends those tools in new ways, both in terms of what kinds of information and solutions can be mined or learned from nature, but also in terms of the processes that are used to do innovation. And so that's, I think, a really important dimension of biomimicry as well.
And I think as the industry evolves, this PhD level, is obviously going to be extremely important. We're pretty unique in our program, aren't we? Can you talk about that for a minute before we leave you?
Sure. The training in biomimicry at the PhD level is literally the first of its kind in the country, probably the world. There are other graduate programs around the world, but none that combine all the elements that we've been able to combine with lots of partners, including industry, sponsoring these fellows and embedding them into their R&D, but also the schools that we're working with. So it's a very multi-dimensional approach that connects that research and takes it beyond the boundaries of the university, which is, I think, absolutely critical.
Dr. Ochaya, do you want to add to this idea of how companies can
Absolutely.
involve?
As an educator right now, I think about this a lot. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to make sure that if you accept biomimicry as a tool, right, it's a mindset, it's an approach, it's another way of looking at problems that you may be dealing with now, or you might start by researching nature to ask what you can learn and then bring that to solve a problem. So there's two different ways of looking at how you might actually apply biomimicry. So with that in mind, we do have, other than the PhD program, we do have a whole spectrum of students, right, from PK through 12, through 2-year universities or colleges, to the 4 years, to the MBA program, all the way to the PhD. Right. So if you look at that whole spectrum, Every step of the way, I think there's an opportunity to engage students and excite their minds and actually educate them as to what biomimicry's potential might be, so that they're better prepared for success that will be coming. Because as we transition from theoretical or academic aspects of biomimicry, we're really trying to make it much more practical, which, as we have already seen, are beginning to take shape. So the sky's the limit. I think we're only going to be limited by our own imagination as to how we engage across the spectrum.
Maybe we can also talk more specifically then about Northeast Ohio's particular position. Peter's obviously already talked about the first PhD program. Maybe, Ven, you can talk a little bit about how we are approaching the K through 12 aspects in Northeast Ohio to position us as global leaders.
Yes. So the PK through 12, there are already institutions around Northeast Ohio that have grabbed this. Lake Ridge Academy, for example, has already revamped the entire curriculum to be biomimetic. And they're already beginning to engage their schools.
Before you move off that, can you just explain a little bit about what their curriculum being biomimetic means?
Sure. So all steps of the way, whether you're looking at biology or science or social science, the students are being engaged and excited about applying the biomimetic lens to look at how they study STEM, for example. And at the university level, that is even more so, because now you have people that have selected particular areas of discipline like biology, like engineering, like math. What we're saying is, beside the traditional way of looking at those disciplines, why not engage and use nature as a way to learn and apply those to the existing discipline and give you a whole new way of looking at problems. And that's what excites the PK through schools right now, and universities like Baldwin Wallace has got a series of courses that are now being offered to students across the curriculum as a collaborative effort, because that's how nature works. Nature does not look at biology one day and then thinks about chemistry the next day and then comes to engineering. It just kind of throws itself in applying its knowledge to kind of solve the problems and evolve and learn and fail and learn and fail. And I think that is the mindset we would like for our students to really adopt and therefore prepare themselves to take advantage.
And Tom Tyrrell, maybe you look like you were about to jump in anyway, maybe you can build on, which is great, build on the Northeast Ohio, once you're finished with your comment, build on Northeast Ohio and our positioning more broad beyond just the K.
Real quick, I was going to mention, to add on, is that the important thing to realize is biomimicry can't be a bolt-on. Our teachers today with core courses and everything else that's being done, they don't have any time to add something else to the program. This has to be done in a way that makes them understand it's going to make teaching and learning more fun, that it can be done on an interdisciplinary basis and taken through almost like a liberal learning type of a process. And so that's exactly the approach we're taking. To answer your question, Rebecca, there's an organization that's in Montana called Biomimicry 3.8. It was started in 1997 by a woman by the name of Janine Benyus, who really has become the godmother of biomimicry. Phenomenal person, natural sciences writer, who began as a holistic movement by moving to the most natural part of the country as she saw it, and began to broaden it out from a network learning experience. We hooked onto this in probably 2008, realizing what they were doing, much of which was network building, a professional education, et cetera, that we as a region had a unique set of circumstances here that entrepreneurially we felt could be drawn and built on to allow us to have a leading position from the start and be able to keep it up in a place-based opportunity. Because to me, the key to being successful is to be able to have place-based opportunities that you build on that can't be taken away from you. So the items that we referred to, other people have them, but the combination and confluence of those things at the point in time we're at is what's unique. The incredible amount of informal training institutions like the Natural History Museum, the Science Center, the Art Museum, and the zoos, smaller, close together, people that are willing to be collaborative, a very solid approach to STEM learning initiatives that's unique to the rest of the country, like what's happening in MC Squared or the Inventors Hall of Fame, that open themselves up to other ideas and creativity, and we'll begin to look at this type of situation. Obviously, an incredible university aggregation opportunity that we as a region need to bring together the way nature does. And if we can focus on tech transfer and development from research standpoints on a together sharing basis, it's a tremendous opportunity, going all the way down to the resources we have from the development of subject matter experts, et cetera. And then I think one of the most important things is that we, in the efforts that we've envisioned in building this, have been recognized as the only global founding affiliate partner of the international institution out of 45 network organizations today for education, leadership, and economic development.
And I think maybe spending another minute on the economic development aspects. I mean, we sort of have talked about several things of how you really integrate it into innovation, but how does it become an economic development driver in our region?
Rebecca, I think one of the keys is once companies get a hold of this and they see the opportunity that it broadens out, it allows them to reach and begin to change not only the way that they think, but the students that we're bringing in here are going to be able to create jobs to be able to fill what we see as companies that are both changing their process and need people to fill those jobs, or drawing companies to where the educational process is taking place. Something we really have never done as we've begun to change from Rust Belt to IT. We never had the confidence that we were going to be successful, so therefore we didn't build in a system. Today, by going in with fellows to corporations like Parker Hannifin, or Sherwin-Williams, or Gojo, or Ross Environmental, or Lubrizol, and putting fellows in there, we're setting examples that can change from an economic development standpoint today. And as they change, beginning with the kids at PK, we're building the continuum to be able to have people get in and operate. And so consequently, it's that thought.
Go ahead,
I'd
Peter.
just like to add one thing that I think is not often emphasized. Biomimicry is a platform that puts two things together that often many people see as in opposition to each other: sustainability and innovation. So biological systems do both of those things at the same time. They complement one another. If we can learn from natural systems to drive innovation in the materials that we make or the processes that we want to drive, and we use principles from biological systems around upcycling, recycling, advanced energy efficiency, we can have both of those things brought together in the way that they're brought together in natural systems. That's a prime imperative in my opinion, right? So if those two things go together instead of being in opposition to one another, all of a sudden some barriers begin to be lowered, I think.
I think one way to make sure that that happens is the recognition that there is a biological aspect to biomimicry, which if you think about how companies hire today and therefore innovate, one of the missing disciplines is really biology. Not many companies hire biologists. So what happens, students that study biology or STEM sometimes go off and do research, which is great.
Right.
But in order to take advantage of the opportunities we see, you absolutely have to go back and say, well, we do need those subject matter experts, people that can look through the lens and have the ability to interpret what they're looking at and say, these are the directions you have to go. And so I think this is an important aspect of what you're just talking about.
And I think just to even maybe put a finer point on it, because it's come out several times, but thinking about the interdisciplinary nature, so to speak, of how everything comes together, you know, whether it's art and design, process, science, education, kind of integrated. So I don't know if anybody wants to build on that point, but just to put it very explicitly, it's extremely integrated, which I feel like that's really what spurs innovation, whether you're talking about biomimicry or other places, is different types of thoughts, diversity of thought, and biomimicry seems like a wonderful lens to really integrate those different types of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that just to put another sort of specific example around that, in the way that it can broaden the audience that you're speaking to, as well as that are joining and creating new kinds of opportunities. We talk about turning STEM, which is obviously an enormous movement in our educational system, into STEAM, because we bring in art and design. And all of a sudden, when you talk about STEAM, you're still talking about innovation through science, technology, engineering, and math, but you're also bringing in the passion, the creativity, and the imagination of art and design. And all of a sudden now, you're not segregating the population of students or restricting the kinds of paths you can follow to get to innovation. So that's critical.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Ben?
Yeah, so just as a final comment on that key question, when you think about Northeast Ohio, right, generally speaking, there was a time where we led the nation and actually the world in terms of innovation. The late 1800s, the early 1900s, we were number one in patents and number of companies created. Brush Electronics, Goodyear, Tire, and rubber. were created at a time when Northeast Ohio was seen as a leading innovation region in the country. I think we have that possibility and the potential right now, given the collaborative nature of the educational institutions that we have, the type of companies that are leading, in the area of biomimicry. That potential exists, and with the right preparation and training, I think we are poised to really take advantage of that and lead the world once again.
Tom, did you want to add anything to that discussion?
No, I think they did a good job. I think I don't need to add anything.
We got that.
I know that surprised a lot of people.
I'll try to recover and ask another question. When you're thinking about, and you've touched on a couple things, but maybe a few more reasons and examples of why should we care? How does this impact our daily lives as we're going about, our work and our home life?
Well, maybe the bottom line to me is that we are living in an unsustainable world. We have in Cleveland an example of urban sprawl. And what we've done to our communities by fleeing from problems of the inner city rather than focusing on solving those problems. Nature doesn't do that. Nature stays and works with it to be able to take it. And what we've done is we've built a infrastructure in our world that is not sustainable. And what is going to happen is we will not have the money to be able to take care of building the roads and the sewer systems and everything else that's happening. We've got to find a way to be able to come back and re-engineer and redesign the way we live within our large communities. Fortunately, today, the 21 through 35-year-olds that grew up in the sustainable era are moving back in and doing that. But biomimicry gives us the tools to look at a collaborative way to come back and build sustainable enterprises that allow us to gather together to solve these problems all over the world. And I think when you take a look at all the things that we're talking about through education, economic development, to me, as I dream, that's what the ultimate outcome of biomimicry is.
Mm-hmm. Ben, Peter?
So we talk about the 3 Ps. Those of you who are, steeped in sustainability, which is a big field for sure, and it's been around for at least 25 years. To a lot of people, that's still a hard concept really to grasp because, there's a lot of incremental piece to it, which is, reduce, reuse, recycle if you're talking about products per se. But I see biomimicry as being probably the next step. Maybe it's a way to operationalize sustainability, or maybe it's a holy grail. I don't know. I think the jury's still out on a lot of that. But to me, that's the hook that we need to latch on, because I would agree that the planet piece is crucial. Whether you believe the science or not, there's a lot of reasons to worry. And not necessarily about the planet per se, because the planet will be here long after we're gone, okay? But I think we worry about the people, and particularly the people that are coming after us, our kids and our grandkids. What kind of world are we leaving behind? I see biomimicry as a potential solution to some of those issues.
Peter, did you also want to
address?
Yeah,
I would just add that that biomimicry provides an opportunity to pair innovation and sustainability to attack problems that have been recognized by the leading thinkers in engineering and science and elsewhere as problems that we have to solve in this century if our society is going to persist. There are things like renewable energy, clean water, crumbling urban infrastructure. All of those problems are problems that the National Academy of Engineers has identified as problems that we don't currently have technologies to solve. So I think that this is an obvious tool to add to many tools that we use to try to address those problems. And I think it's ideal, and it is unique in that pairing of sustainability with innovation. That material in the lampshade oyster is made at ambient temperature and pressure in water. We don't have bulletproof materials that we make through our engineering technologies that satisfy that. So what we're saying is we can have materials like that that have the kinds of performance that awe us. And we can do it in a way that borrows the recipes from nature that add to sustainability, not take away from it. I think that's for me, that drives it home.
Great. So today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're enjoying a Friday forum panel discussion on biomimicry. We will return to our panelists momentarily. for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We would encourage you to formulate your questions for our panelists now, and remind you please to keep your questions very brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those joining us through our primary media partners, 90.3 WCPN, 104.9 WCLV, and WVIZ PBS Idea Stream, or on one of the other many radio stations across the country that carry the City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by the Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live broadcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Friday, April 25th, the City Club welcomes Dave Abbott, Executive Director of the Gun Foundation. For more information about any upcoming forums, or to make a reservation, or to order the CD or DVD for today's program, please refer to our website, www.cityclub.org. Today, we welcome guests from tables hosted by the Great Lakes Biomimicry and Hiram College. Thank you very much for your support of this forum. We welcome students to today's forum as well. Student participation is made possible by generous gifts from the Pipeline Development Company. Joining us today are students from Old Trail School and John Hay High School. Will the students please stand? Be recognized. Thank you for your continued support. Now we would like to return to the panelists for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including our guests. Holding the microphones today for the program are our program director, Carrie Miller, right there, and marketing and outreach specialist, Kirsten Panaka. There we go. If we could have the first question, please.
Sometimes it's up to me to break the ice. A concern and then a question. It's such a nifty concept that it runs the risk of becoming a really nifty metaphor and nothing more. And so that's the concern. But the question for all of you is, Tom, you mentioned the public sector infrastructure problems and challenges that we face. But I haven't heard from any of you how biomimicry can help us rethink how we approach public sector challenges. We've heard a lot about private sector innovation, but not so much public sector challenges. And if there are cities that have used biomimicry to solve the challenges that they're facing, tell us those stories.
That's a great question.
Well, probably the biggest factor is that biomimicry is not a discipline today. There are no textbooks written about it. There's a group that started it in 1997, and Da Vinci used it, and the Wright brothers used it, laying in their backs watching turkey vultures on thermals. And it's broadened out to where there are a multiplicity of products that have been developed from it today. But it's just really turning into a science. As part of that process, it's a learning curve to be able to figure out how are you going to get this message out that's other than simply a broad network of here's an idea, start thinking about the process. I'm an entrepreneur, I don't like that, I like this, here's the depth, what's the ROI going to be, how are we going to build and benefit our region on a long-term basis, and oh, by the way, as we do that, be able to change the rest of the world, and then being creative ideas we have to come back place-based allow us to sustain that position. So some of those things are the types of education that we can reach out to that sector to be able to help to educate them in the way they operate. Organizational design and development is a great one. And we've got part of our team developing a curriculum for that process to be able to go in and change culture, to begin to think about how do you adapt and accept these things to be able to bring them in and drive creativity from a collaborative fashion. We, as humans, don't function that way. We generally build ourselves into silos. We do a really good job of that most of the time in Northeast Ohio, but it's got to change. And the way it changes is by getting people to think about it differently. And once you say to yourself, and I found it myself, is that as we began this process over 4 years ago to be able to try and change to this model, I found myself saying, well, we've got to be able to get a veneer on here on the way society works and begin to think differently. And my engineering friends would come back to me and said, no, it's not right. It isn't right, because what happens is all of us, when we were 3, 4, and 5, and 6 years old, we're out there playing in nature, playing with bugs, playing with rabbits, running in fields, and left to those mores, we would have thought about how to use nature to solve a problem. But society changed that. Society basically put that veneer over us. We don't have to take one off. We don't have to pull one out. We've got to remove one in that process. So our job here is to be able to help drive an educational model. 3.8 is focused on product design, on a broad network-based process, and on professional education. We're focused on getting it into companies today, getting into organizations today, getting it into PK, and beginning to change the way people think, so they will go out there, creating the conditions. We're not shoving it down people's throats. We're going to be very small. It's to create conditions to be able to educate people to look through that lens, to be able to have toolkits, subject matter experts available for that process. So when somebody says, I have a need, we've got somebody to lock them up with to help them look at it, whether in the private or the public sector.
So Peter, did you want to build a little bit on that?
It's a great question, and there's a fine line because you need to have broad and quick awareness of something to get the kind of traction where you can take more time to tell the story and to help people understand it and to invite them in to help you understand it more deeply. That's what we're trying to do by building the discipline and by rolling that out, not just in the cloistered corners and basements of a university, but connecting that to schools. So if you can capture people's imagination because it's something cool and flashy and get them to pause a little bit and bring them in a little bit deeper, then you can, I think, get past the concern or the worry. It's always going to be there. There's always snake oil charmers and salesmen and and greenwashing, etc. But if you do the work on the back side, you can use that awareness to accelerate how you reach people.
This is an amazing and exciting concept, and I really appreciate it. Actually two questions. First of all, in nature there are millions, perhaps billions of systems that could possibly inform a solution. So how do you sort through the multitude of possibles for the application? So Tom, you talked about the bullet train and the bird's beak. Well, there's thousands of birds. How did you figure out this bird? You talked about the kingfisher. How did you figure out this fish? So that's the first question. The second question is there medical application, health-related applications for biomimicry?
Yeah, so it's another fantastic question. I think the answer is that what we're trying to do and what others have been doing and that we're building on and who we're collaborating with is to bring a process into the growth of the discipline so that there is a design thinking process that can recover all of those various systems, understand them, and then abstract the important principles of those systems as they align with the problem you're trying to solve. That's actually a very fundamental aspect of design thinking, right? What is the problem you're trying to solve, really? Identifying that, using that at an abstract level to connect it to systems that solve that problem. So it's about abstraction of a problem or a solution and making the connection. You can create databases that you can mine either by people mining them or have a software interface that mines them. All of those are probably part of the solution, but it's that understanding of abstracting solutions and problems and being able to use an interdisciplinary approach to talk about them and apply them. Does that sort of make sense?
Is that where the international network probably comes in really valuable too, is that piece?
That's exactly right. And the key to what you're saying is there's a myriad number of solutions out there. This is still in its infancy, and to be able to identify which one is the right one is very difficult. So we've got to change the way that we think about it. As humans, we tend to see something and then we want to keep it to ourselves because we might make some money off of this, or so greed takes over. We're not going to change the world if that's the attitude. This has got to be a value proposition that's shared, where when you have an idea, you don't do it in isolation. You bring other experts to it, and you don't try to do it yourself. You reach out to other universities, other institutions, to draw in a series of experts, to make them part of your subject matter expert. And as you develop these solutions, you share those solutions, and you take in ideas to be able to broaden out. So the value proposition of what you'll get out of doing this is much greater if you share it and open up to it than it is if you do it yourself.
Great.
Question for Dr. Ochaya. One of the principles that we see in nature, and I believe it's one of the biomimicry principles, is that everything is interconnected in nature. And so we spoke about how students can be inspired by examples, how can make learning more fun, particularly in the STEM fields. But then tying it to the kinds of challenges that these students are facing, we all are facing in the 21st century, the challenges of complexity, particularly where you have long-term effects or very complex causal connections between systems. I'm wondering if you could speak to the relationship between biomimicry education and education in systems thinking, and how the ability, the mental and cognitive abilities to think in whole systems terms can be enhanced through biomimetic education.
Yeah, so that's a really big question that I'm sure experts are spending sleepless nights trying to figure out. But at the end of the day, though, the systems thinking is at the root of engagement that we talked about in terms of how do you excite students, kids from a very early age. As Tom was talking about, I mean, once you put a kid in a natural environment, you just see the excitement and the natural inquisitiveness that comes out, the curiosity, the ability to ask questions, why? I mean, you remember those days. I think we tap into that, but it's very important also to not isolate the student. And I believe in failure, learning from your failure. So let them experience, let them fail, let them fall, let them say, why did I fall? And then let's ask somebody else, how come you didn't fall, right? And then from that interaction, I think you begin to kind of leverage the learning. The reason we look at this as a spectrum from very early, and we kind of segment them that way is for precisely that reason that you're talking about. They all learn at different ways, different styles, different approaches. But putting them together, they learn from each other. I think we all learn from each other. And I think this is the power biomimicry has, because if we want to truly emulate nature, we have to be collaborative. That means I have certain aspects or skills that I bring. You bring something else, and together we actually try to figure it out. So the two ways to approach this is really just go to nature and learn from nature and see what nature does, and then say, how can we bring this in to kind of excite the next level of curiosity or innovation. On the other hand, you start with the problem, right? You might be having a problem that you don't know how to solve. The bullet train is a very good example. The engineers were stumped. They had no way of knowing what the solution was to the sonic boom, until somebody actually saw something in nature and said, how come that bird flies straight into the water and doesn't make a splash? And they started to say, walk backwards and solve the problem. That's how they did. So kids can have one of those mindsets as well, but all along the way we need to encourage them to be able to ask those questions and give them the room to learn from not having answers and then following through systematically, collecting that information that will lead them to the right place.
Yeah, and that openness that Tom was talking about, I mean, you kind of said, but that openness is the cycle, right? So if these kids are growing up using this biomimetic lens, it's a snowball effect, right, over time for that to continue and be even more impactful.
Absolutely.
The recent United Nations report on climate change suggests that we humans are facing a very difficult few decades. How does biomimicry and your description of its methods, does it have any connection or any help that we can look to try and solve some of those problems on the scientific level? Forget the political.
I think they're both important, but I'll speak to the scientific. There are emerging technologies around renewable sources of energy where instead of, or understanding that fossil fuels are finite, looking towards solutions like devices which capture sunlight and make a biofuel like hydrogen gas, modeled on how a leaf does photosynthesis. In fact, in the last year, there have been some pretty interesting breakthroughs at both MIT and Harvard. It's still not ready for prime time, but the point is, in the last 20 years, it's made enormous progress towards getting to something which will be biomimetic as a source of alternative energy. On the other side, in terms of, say, greenhouse gases, there are, again, some emerging technologies that are actually being piloted where one of the most noxious greenhouse gas producing products, which is cement, concrete actually, we can replace that with something, borrowing the recipe from coral animals, that take CO2 out of water to make their shells that make coral reefs, to make a replacement product, which instead of releasing CO2, actually captures CO2. Again, it's not ready for prime time, but it's in pilot stage. And it's a really important factor because by 2050, I think it's predicted there will be about 10 billion people on this planet, and about 60% of them will live in cities. Those are the projections. So we're going to be building more things, and we're going to need building materials that don't exacerbate the situation we already have. We have to sort of begin to go in the other direction. So those are just two examples.
Anybody want to build on that?
Yeah, so let me just build on that. The green cement idea is powerful because when you think about the greenhouse gases, right now we just surpassed the highest level of carbon dioxide ever in terms of parts per million just last year. So what that means is technologies like the one that Peter just mentioned, where you can produce a ton of this green cement by taking 50%. For each ton you take half a ton of carbon dioxide off the air. That is a very sustainable model in the long term, but you can't rest on just one recipe. I think you need to look for opportunities to tap into a lot more areas just like that.
Tying into economic development, one of the keys to being successful is not to have to create a market for your products. The stuff that you're talking about, there's a market out there. And when you see 45 organizations that are in 19 of them outside of North America that are beginning to focus on what is biomimicry, and most of them just network building, a very few of them, San Diego for one, doing a little bit on economic development. We are the only ones in the world who are focused on educationally driven economic development, and we're way ahead of the rest of them. And we're doing it with absolutely no resources. Everything was done entrepreneurially, 19,000 volunteer hours to be able to get to this point as an entrepreneurial startup process. When you've got $1.6 trillion of global GDP opportunity, what else do we have in this region, everything together that comes even close to that process? That's why 45 places in the world are looking at doing it. And what we want to do is do it in a way that we can take advantage of both sides of the equation. And the types of things that you're talking about is a built-in market opportunity. We go ahead and solve the things that we've been vilified for in Northeast Ohio and solve them ourselves to be able to correct our problems and then become the solution to the rest of the world. It's going to do a lot of things.
Just one more thing on that, because the political side I think is critical. We have not learned enough about how natural systems deal with and respond to things like disruption and disruptive technologies. The cement technology, part of the resistance to furthering that research and rolling it out is that it's a disruptive technology that basically has the potential to pull out the economics of the existing infrastructure, right? So that's a threatening proposition. It's a disruptive technology, deeply disruptive technology. What can we learn from natural systems about how they can respond and be resilient to disruptions and disruptive technologies in nature that will help us better maybe structure our political and social systems to allow these things to flow rather than to erect barriers? That's really something that biomimicry is not doing very much with at all, but I think there's huge potential.
And that goes back to Dan's original public sector question. I mean, that's a lot of the public sector engagement.
First of all, I'd like to say that I think it was Picasso who said that we were all born artists, but we learn to suppress that as we get older.
I learned it very well.
And also, I don't see how you can separate the scientific from the political, because the political often determines what's going to get funded, what kind of research and what kind of development is going to occur, even in areas like engineering.
Sure. Absolutely.
It's highly political. So I would like to comment about your questions about partnershiping between sustainability and innovation as far as solving infrastructure problems that we have created. One example is the brownfields movement. Are you in law and in real estate? Brownfields is taking contaminated inner city infrastructure properties and attempting to clean them up, maybe not to the level where you could use them for residential or a playground or a retail, but perhaps use them for a warehouse or a parking lot or it's called a voluntary action program, where the owners engage in this program to clean it up to a point where it's clean enough. And so that's an area where you're bringing the two together, and I think that biomimicry might have applications as far as brownfields.
Absolutely.
Just a question back there. Oh.
Hi. The Fellows Program at the University of Akron seems like brain gain for the region. Could you talk a little bit about the Fellows? Tell us a little bit more about them.
Peter?
Sure. They're wonderful. They've come from around the world, because this is the first place where they could do what they're seeking to do, which is to earn a PhD in the area of biomimicry. They come from all disciplines. That's one of the unique aspects of our program. Students coming from environmental science and international relations, for example. We have one of those in our program, Emily Kennedy. Coming from biotechnology, coming from engineering, coming from tried and true biology. And we're hoping to attract students from architecture and from design. And certainly our program is open to that. As we build capacity to get faculty to work with these students, we'll be rolling out that diversity. But right now, we're building on what they bring, which is a tremendous diversity of experience from different disciplines, and trying to lay the groundwork that will make it easier for the next cohort of students. So I think we have 6 right now.
He doesn't toot his own horn very much, which is a hard question to ask him, but what I'm really proud of is that we started this organization from nothing, and we were able to build a model that attracted 5 students from Taiwan, from Belgium, from West Germany, from Boston through Australia in a summer program, and from Hawaii, that basically wanted to change the world through biomimicry, and we're told in those countries the place to do it is Northeast Ohio. Now, literally, we're still operating out of the back seat of my car, albeit it's a nice back seat. But that's a phenomenal opportunity. We've got these people here for 5 years. They're embedded in our companies. They're embedded in beta schools like MC Squared Inventors Hall of Fame. They're going to give us that energy over a 5-year time frame to be able to help to build us up from a value proposition in terms of becoming the center of educational and economic development processes in biomimicry. And the companies that we're putting these fellows into have right of first refusal on that value proposition. The intent is 4 business fellows and 4 education fellows going into 4 schools and 4 corporations every year for a total of 8 times 5 years. 40 means we've got 40 people that are embedded, in addition to the programs we're doing at Lorain County Community College and the Cleveland Institute of Art and BW, because lots of kids come in that want to be doctors, but then they change, it's not what I want to do, but they've got the sense of STEM and biology there. Where are they going? And maybe it's all research. Now they got an opportunity to go out there and really create innovation and working with companies, bring a feature to those companies that they don't have, that they really don't
I don't
have.
think we've said it explicitly. The University of Akron has made investments to build, the program, but also then on the company side, they're actually putting money in to make sure that these fellows, so they're investing in having these fellows embedded.
It's a neat, and it's exactly right. The companies that we go into, like Parker Hannifin, contribute $125,000 over 5 years. And that basically takes the place of the stipend that the students would get for doing graduate assistant work. And so for that, they go into the companies 15 to 20 hours a week to help educate them in looking through a biomimetic lens with some already pretty significant results. And so consequently, the companies are the ones that are sponsoring. Foundations are able to support us in putting the education fellows into the schools to be able to do the same thing and then draw the teachers. And in the summertime, we build a stipend program through the work in the foundations to be able to educate the rest of the teachers. So in the first year, 1 fellow and 1 teacher goes out to 4 teachers, 6 teachers. MC Squared is a great case in point. The sophomore year is at Nela Park. We went in there through CMSD. And we're teaching an immersion right now in biomimicry. They've got 5 teachers, 100 students, a great system, and they've got social sciences, engineering, mathematics, English, and biology, and it's an interdisciplinary approach with a Fab Lab model where all of those interdisciplinary come together to be able to teach it. And our dream will be to take it to the 11th grade next year, the 12th grade the year after that. So we've got a model where we're teaching every person in an educational institution. 400 kids are coming out of there understanding how biomimicry works. And that's exactly what we're trying to do at high schools throughout the region.
So we have 2 minutes left or so we have time for maybe one more quick question.
So biomimicry is very fascinating, but I'm not a scientist. So what can everyday people do? How can they use biomimicry to solve problems that they encounter?
Great final question. So,
I think that the place to start would be to just look and observe. In the biomimicry design thinking process, that's where we start. So observing nature, whether it's an organism or whether it's a system, whether it's your backyard, whatever it is, asking questions about what do you see, how do the things relate to one another, what processes, what actions do you see? And then from that, ask what kinds of problems are being addressed. What is the organism that comes out of the frozen ground into the melting pond, amphibians this time of year, to breed? What challenge did they solve by making it through the winter to get thawed out and get into the breeding grounds to continue the cycle? And then maybe there's a lesson in there for what you might do to protect something for freezing, or to. Yeah. I got the okay. So there might be, in other words, observe, abstract what you see, and ask how you might apply it. That's how Velcro came to be. Mm-hmm. A guy walking his dog with burrs stuck on it. He said, "Wow, that stinks.
Strong.
Those things are sticking to my dog, and I've got to clean those off." Yeah. And then he said, "Oh, that's a new fastener." Mm-hmm. Yep, put it under a microscope. Saw the structure, Velcro, $10 billion industry.
So I wanted to thank our panelists today, Tom Tyrrell, Dr. Ben Ochaya, and Dr. Peter Niewiarowski. Today at the City Club, we have been listening to the Friday Forum panel discussion on biomimicry. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.